Your fish isn't sick. It's not dying. It's just off, hiding a little more than usual, flaring at nothing, ignoring food it normally goes crazy for. And if you've ever caught yourself thinking, he's just shy, or she's just like that, stop right there. That explanation is almost never true. Fish don't really have moods the way we imagine moods. What looks like personality is almost always a direct response to something happening in their environment, something you're doing without realizing it, probably every single day. And most of it is completely invisible to you. Your fish was built to notice it. You weren't. Here's what nobody explains to you at the pet store. The advice you get at checkout is almost entirely chemistry and equipment. Water parameters, filter media, dosing schedules. That's real, and it matters. But it's only half the animal. The other half is behavioral. Fish have a nervous system built for reading their environment constantly. Light, vibration, movement, routine. And that system is either telling their body, you're safe, or stay alert. Which one it's saying determines almost everything about how that fish actually lives, not just whether it survives. Pet stores don't sell you this half. There's no bottle for it, no cartridge, no subscription. So it just doesn't get mentioned. Today I'm giving you 17 of these hacks and blind spots that shape how your fish actually experiences its tank, most of which cost you nothing and take seconds to apply. Some of these are things experienced breeders do automatically without ever explaining why. A few come straight out of behavioral research most hobbyists never see. And I'm saving the last one for the very end, because once you understand it, you'll realize it's not really hack number 17. It's the thing quietly running underneath all 16 of the others. It's the actual reason some tanks feel alive, and others just feel occupied. Let's get into it. Number 1. The reflection nobody accounts for. You turn the room lights off at night, and your fish suddenly goes rigid, flares at the glass, or bolts to the far corner. Most owners assume it's random spooking. It's not random. At night, with the tank lit and the room dark, your tank's glass becomes a mirror. Your fish sees another fish, a rival, holding the exact same position, mirroring every move. For a territorial species, that's a threat that never leaves and never backs down, night after night. Fix. Dim the room gradually before the tank light shuts off, or run a low ambient light nearby so the glass never turns into a full mirror. It's a 30-second change that removes a stressor your fish has been dealing with every single night. Number 2. Vibration is a sense you don't have. You place the tank near a doorway, a subwoofer, or a hallway with heavy foot traffic because it fits the room. The fish seem fine at first glance. The lateral line is genuinely interesting. Let that show. Fish have a sensory organ humans don't, the lateral line, a strip of receptors running along their body that detects pressure changes and vibration in water. Footsteps, slammed doors, bass-heavy speakers. All of it translates into a constant, low-grade alarm signal your fish can't opt out of, even when nothing is visibly wrong. Fix. If you have the choice, place the tank against an interior wall, away from speakers and high-traffic doorways. If you can't move it, at minimum, stop tapping the glass. That vibration hits their lateral line directly, every time. Number 3. The myth of the aggressive fish. A fish starts flaring, chasing, or patrolling one corner obsessively, and the instinct is to label it an aggressive species, or just a mean one. Often, what's actually happening is a territory problem, not a personality problem. A tank that's too small or too open forces fish into constant boundary disputes because there's nowhere to retreat and reset. The aggression isn't who the fish is. It's a response to a space that doesn't let it de-escalate. Fix. Break the sightlines. Adding dense plants, rockwork, or driftwood that interrupts a straight line of sight lets a lower-ranking fish get out of view and stop being chased, which resolves more so-called aggression problems than removing the fish ever does. Number 4. Feeding time is a clock your fish can read. You feed whenever you remember. Sometimes morning, sometimes night, sometimes you forget entirely and double up the next day. Fish that are fed on a consistent schedule start anticipating it. Behavioral researchers call this an entrained response, the same mechanism behind any animal that learns to expect a routine event. That anticipation isn't trivial. A predictable schedule is associated with lower baseline stress in captive animals generally, because uncertainty itself is a stressor. Random feeding keeps a fish in a mild, constant state of, is it time yet? Fix. Feed it roughly the same 1 or 2 times a day. You don't need precision to the minute, just enough consistency that your fish's body can predict it. Number 5. New decor isn't exciting, it's frightening. You rearrange the tank to freshen it up, and your fish disappears for 2 days. Fish, like most prey animals, carry a built-in caution around anything new in their environment, a response researchers refer to as Neophobia. A brand new object dropped into a territory they've already mapped isn't a gift. It's an unknown that could be dangerous until proven otherwise. And until it's proven safe, hiding is the correct survival strategy. Fix. When you add new decor, move only part of the layout at a time, rather than the whole tank at once, and leave familiar landmarks in place. Familiarity is what tells your fish the rest of the territory is still safe. Number 6. Shoaling fish have a minimum head count, and it's not about looks. You buy 3 or 4 schooling fish because that's what fits the tank, and they spend most of their time hovering nervously near the filter instead of swimming freely. Schooling isn't decorative, it's a security behavior. Below a certain group size, shoaling species can't form the loose, coordinated movement that actually reduces individual vigilance. Each fish ends up watching for danger alone, instead of relying on the group, which keeps its stress response elevated, even though nothing is actually threatening it. Fix. Research the specific minimum for your species. 6 is a common baseline for many tetras and rasboras, and treat that number as the actual requirement, not a suggestion. A group of 6 behaves completely differently than a group of 3. We're about a third of the way through. Stick around, because number 12 is the one that changed how I think about problem fish entirely. Number 7. Thermal shock during water changes. You do a water change and refill straight from the tap, sometimes a few degrees warmer or colder than the tank, without really checking. A sudden temperature shift, even a small one, doesn't just feel uncomfortable to a fish. It's a physiological stressor. Rapid temperature change affects metabolic rate and can trigger a measurable stress response, on top of whatever handling stress the water change already caused. Fix. Match the refill water temperature to the tank as closely as you reasonably can before adding it back. A cheap thermometer in the fill bucket takes the guesswork out entirely. Number 8. Acclimation is slower than you think. New fish comes home in a bag. You float it for 10 or 15 minutes to match the temperature, then release it straight into the tank. Temperature is only half the acclimation problem. The chemistry of the bag water, pH, dissolved compounds built up during transport, can be meaningfully different from your tank water, and dumping a fish from one straight into the other creates an osmotic shock on top of the temperature adjustment. Floating the bag handles temperature. It does nothing for chemistry. Fix. Use a slow drip acclimation, a length of airline tubing with a valve, dripping tank water into a container with the fish over 30 to 60 minutes before release. It's the single biggest reduction in transport stress you can give a new arrival, and it costs a few dollars in tubing. Quick pause before we go further. If this is reframing how you think about your tank, this is genuinely the kind of channel where subscribing actually gets you something. I go deep on the behavioral side of fish keeping that most channels skip entirely, and there's a lot more of it coming. Hit subscribe and let's keep going. Number 9. The light you turn off like a switch. You flip the tank light off at night the same way you'd flip off a lamp. Instant darkness. In nature, light fades gradually over dusk. An abrupt cut to darkness removes the transitional cues fish use to settle into a rest state, and can trigger a startle response in fish caught mid-swim when the light vanishes. Fix. If your light has a dimmable setting, use it, or add a small moonlight-style LED that stays on for 10 to 15 minutes after the main light shuts off. It mimics dusk instead of an on/off switch. Number 10. Digging isn't destruction, it's a need. A fish constantly rearranges the substrate, moves gravel around, or seems obsessed with one particular corner of the tank floor, and the impulse is to keep smoothing it back out. For a lot of species, many cichlids, loaches, and gouramis among them, substrate interaction is an innate foraging and territory marking behavior, not random mess making. Denying that outlet entirely especially with substrate that's too coarse or too fine to manipulate, can leave that behavioral drive with nowhere to go. Fix. Research whether your species is a natural digger, and if so, let it dig. Fighting a behavioral need by constantly resetting the substrate just keeps the fish repeating the same frustrated pattern. Number 11. Glass surfing is a stress signal, not a personality trait. A betta or cichlid paces the same stretch of glass over and over, and it gets described online as hyper, or just active. Repetitive, fixed pattern movement against the glass is generally recognized as a stereotypy, a behavior pattern associated with chronic stress or an understimulated environment. Similar in concept to pacing seen in other captive animals. It's not energy, it's a coping behavior for a situation the fish can't escape or resolve. Fix. Add complexity. Plants. Decor with varied structure, alternating sightlines, rather than more open swimming space. Fish pacing glass usually need more to interact with, not more room to pace in. Number 12. Fish recognize you, and that changes their stress response. Your fish rushes to the front of the tank the second you walk into the room, before you've touched the food container at all. This isn't imagination. Several species of fish have been shown in behavioral studies to distinguish individual human faces and associate specific people with specific outcomes, like feeding. Once that association is formed, your presence itself can shift the fish's behavior from cautious to anticipatory, which is a meaningfully lower stress state than treating every approach as an unknown. Fix. Move predictably near the tank rather than making sudden, fast movements, especially in the first weeks with a new fish. You're not just a feeder to them, you're becoming a known, low-threat presence, and that recognition is worth reinforcing. Told you 12 would matter. 5 more to go, and they get more specific to the species you're likely keeping right now. Number 13. The alpha fish isn't always actually dominant. One fish seems to control the tank, chasing others from food, claiming the best hiding spot, and it gets labeled the boss. In a lot of community tanks, that behavior isn't stable hierarchy, it's a resource scarcity response. When there's exactly one good hiding spot or one feeding zone, whichever fish claims it first will defend it aggressively, regardless of its actual temperament, simply because losing that resource has real consequences. Fix. Duplicate the contested resource. Add a second hiding spot, a second feeding area on the opposite side of the tank. Often, the aggressive fish calms down dramatically once there's nothing scarce left to guard. Number 14. Cloudy eye and clamped fins often show up before anything else. A fish seems totally normal, then a day or two later, it's visibly sick, and it feels like it came out of nowhere. It rarely does. Clamped fins, faster gill movement, and reduced interest in food are early behavioral indicators that typically precede visible disease symptoms by a day or more. The fish's behavior changes before its appearance does, because behavior is cheaper for the body to adjust than tissue. Fix. Learn what normal fin position and swimming rhythm look like for each fish individually, not the species in general. The deviation from that individual's normal is the earliest warning you'll get, well before anything shows up that a test kit would catch. Number 15. Tank placement affects more than just temperature. You put the tank wherever it physically fits, maybe right next to a window, maybe under a bright ceiling light that's on all evening. Beyond algae, inconsistent or excessive ambient light disrupts the photoperiod your fish's internal rhythm is trying to track. Fish, like most animals, regulate cortisol-equivalent stress hormones partly through light cycling. An environment where day and night don't follow a predictable pattern keeps that regulation slightly off, continuously. Fix. Put the tank light on a timer set for a consistent daily photoperiod, independent of whatever the room lighting happens to be doing. Consistency matters more than the exact number of hours. Number 16. Silence isn't actually safety. You assume a tank with no visible activity, fish tucked away, minimal movement, just means everything is calm. Sometimes it does, but a dramatic drop in normal activity level, especially paired with reduced feeding response, is itself a behavioral signal worth investigating, rather than a sign everything's fine. Fish conserve energy and reduce visible activity as a general response to stress or illness, which can look, at a glance, exactly like a calm tank. Fix. Compare activity against that fish's individual baseline, not against fish are supposed to be calm. A sudden quiet fish is a data point, not automatically a good sign. Before number 17. And like I said at the start, this one isn't really separate from the other 16. It's what all of them were actually pointing at the whole time. Every single hack on this list, the lighting, the feeding schedule, the acclimation, the decor changes, the tank placement, they're all, underneath, about the same single variable: predictability. A fish's stress response isn't primarily triggered by any one bad event. It's triggered by unpredictability, an environment where light, food, territory, and vibration don't follow a pattern the fish can learn and rely on. Every time you make one part of that environment more consistent, you're not fixing one isolated problem. You're lowering the baseline level of vigilance your fish is running at, all the time, in the background, whether you can see it or not. That's why none of this is sold to you at the checkout counter. There's no bottle labeled consistency, no cartridge that ships it to your door. It's not a product, it's a habit of how you run the tank, and it costs nothing but attention. The tanks that look effortless, the ones where the fish seem confident, curious, out in the open, they're not lucky, they're predictable environments. That's the actual forbidden hack. It was never really about the equipment. So think back to that fish we opened with, hovering in the corner, seeming off for no reason. It was the mirror it couldn't stop seeing, the vibration it couldn't tune out, the territory it couldn't defend, the schedule it couldn't predict, the new object it couldn't trust yet, the group too small to feel safe in, the temperature swing it wasn't braced for, the chemistry shift it wasn't given time to adjust to, the light switching off like a door slamming, the digging it wasn't allowed to do, the glass it was pacing because it had nothing else to interact with, the face it was starting to recognize as safe, the resource it had to guard alone, the early warning written in its fins before you could see it in its scales, the photoperiod that never quite settled, the quiet that wasn't calm at all. And underneath every one of those, the same missing thread, predictability, running through the whole tank. None of that was personality. It was all information. You just needed to know how to read it. Next video, I'm taking one of these, the territory and aggression piece, and going deep on exactly how to redesign a community tank's layout so fish that don't get along actually do. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and I'll see you in the next one.